Take more walking along. Come to the general debate on Lord Etherton's independent review into the treatment of LGBT veterans. I call the Secretary of State to move. John Healey.
Here, here, here. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In July last year, Lord Etherton's report on LGBT veterans shone a much-needed light on a dark period in Britain's military history. An era between 1967 and 2000 when LGBT people were banned from serving in our armed forces. An era when homophobic bullying, harassment and abuse were widespread. An era when LGBT personnel were demoted, dismissed or driven out of the forces for their sexuality. And the testimony of those who gave evidence to Etherton's review and who have courageously campaigned for justice are truly harrowing. The very values of a tolerant Western democracy that we expected those forces personnel to defend were denied to them. It was profoundly wrong. And I've been determined as Defence Secretary that we will continue the work of the previous government to deal with the injustices suffered by so many LGBT personnel. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to Lord Etherton for his work and for his report. I'm grateful also to the support of the group Fighting with Pride and the coalition of more than 20 charities that back their work. I'm grateful to them for providing the government with invaluable guidance and advice on a range of restorative actions, some of which I'm able to announce today. I'm also grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the very small team of officials that have worked from the outset within the MOD on this area, and grateful too for the way that members of both sides of the House have come together to recognise the injustice and to support the actions first the previous government and now this are willing to take. This is unfinished business for Labour. We lifted the ban in 2000. We argued for the Etherton Review in the Armed Forces Bill in 2001. We welcomed the Etherton Review recommendations and publication. And in opposition, we called on the previous government to deliver on the previous Defence Secretary's pledge for a debate in this House, he said, quite rightly, in order to make sure the House properly debates the report and the government's response to it. Today, our government delivers on that commitment, and it is an honour for me as Defence Secretary to open this debate. So in doing so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd also like to update the House on the actions that we are taking now as a new government to right these historic wrongs to LGBT veterans. First, among the remaining recommendations made by Etherton, I can announce today that we are establishing a financial recognition scheme. When this scheme goes live tomorrow, it will mean that almost all of the 49 recommendations made by Lord Etherton will have been delivered. Recommendations 28 and 29 in his report specifically refer to financial award, a tangible payment to reflect government accountability and our determination to recognise these historic failings. So I'm pleased to announce that we're launching today a LGBT financial recognition scheme with a total budget of £75 million, which is 50% higher than the level recommended in the Etherton Review and the cap set by the last government. This financial recognition scheme will open tomorrow, 1 year to the day that the previous government responded to Lord Etherton's report. Madam Deputy Speaker, this scheme provides two types of payment to recognise the discrimination and the detriment suffered by LGBT personnel under the ban. First is for those who were dismissed or discharged. This will be available for veterans who were dismissed or administratively discharged, including officers instructed to resign because of their actual or perceived sexual orientation or their gender identity under the ban. This payment will be at a flat rate of £50,000. Second, it's for those who were impacted in other ways. This LGBT impact payment is open to all those who experienced pain and suffering under the ban, including harassment, intrusive investigations, and indeed, in some cases, imprisonment. The impact payment will be assessed by an independent panel with tariffs ranging between £1,000 and £20,000 to make the awards fair and proportionate to each individual. And these two payments will run concurrently as part of a single financial recognition scheme. We've also, Madam Deputy Speaker, set aside funding from the MOD to support those charities that can advise applicants to these schemes. And as a result of the additional funding that we've allocated, payments can reach up to a maximum of £70,000 for those who were most impacted, most hurt, and who qualify for both awards. The scheme will remain open for 2 years, and applications for payments from the scheme from terminally ill veterans will be prioritised. Madam Deputy Speaker, all payments from both schemes will be exempt from income tax and will not affect benefits that applicants may receive. It will open tomorrow morning. Fuller details will be online at that point. And Madam Deputy Speaker, our decision to listen to the views expressed on the last government's plans to uplift the value of this scheme, to deliver it within 1 year of the recommendations being accepted, I hope demonstrates our profound regret and our determination to do right by our LGBT personnel. But there are 3 additional important restorative announcements I also can make today. First, for those who were administratively discharged based on their actual or perceived sexual orientation, will be able to apply to get their records set straight. As a result of the ban, will be shown as the reason. As a result, the ban will be shown as the reason for their discharge, finally removing any blame or dishonour on their record from those who have served. Second, we will restore to the ranks of veterans who've had. We will restore the ranks of veterans who've had them reduced as a result of the ban, ensuring that they regain the rank they rightfully earned in service. And third, while not within the scope of Lord Etherton's review, which of course covered the ban between 1967 and 2000, we also want to acknowledge that any LGBT veterans who served before 1967 and who may have suffered under the ban. So we're taking further action to recognise their service and their contribution. As a result, these veterans can now apply to have their administrative discharges qualified, their rank restored if it had been reduced, certificates of service reissued, and former officers may also apply to have their service details published in the Gazette as part of the official record. Madam Deputy Speaker, working on these restorative measures, meeting affected veterans has not been easy, but it has also shown me how much progress our modern armed forces are making. There has been a change in culture, there has been a change in prevailing attitudes, and Britain's military today is more inclusive and more tolerant than in the past. Each of the services has held presentation ceremonies to welcome LGBT veterans back into the family where they have always belonged. And whilst there has been change and there has been progress, there is no place for prejudice in the modern armed forces. And we still have more to do to reinforce zero tolerance of any discrimination or abuse anywhere in defence.
Would my right honourable friend be quick?
I will, of course.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I have a constituent who is not a member of the armed forces, but was a member of the Secret Service. And he lost his job in the 1980s because he was gay. And there is no compensation for him at the moment. I suspect this may not be the responsibility of my right honourable friend, but does he not agree with me that there should be parity of treatment across the forces? We rely on our Secret Service as much as we do our armed forces, and surely what's fair for them should be also fair for those who have given their time and risked their lives in the service of our country.
Well, my right honourable friend makes the powerful point that discrimination, harassment, systematic, in some cases, abuse is not confined and has not been confined in the past to the military. It's a concern that has been raised by civilians at times within the wider defence field, and I and the ministers in this team are as concerned about that as in the military. But I think she'll appreciate we ask those who put on the uniform for our country to take on a very special role, to step forward, to be willing to give their lives to defend the rest of us. And when those very basic values that they fight for, that our country stands for, are denied to them as part of their service, then that is a deep injustice for which Lord Etherton's report gives us the basis to recognise and restore. And that's the focus of my concern in this debate. Madam Deputy Speaker, in September, the Minister for Veterans and People and I were proud also to present the first Etherton ribbons to veterans as a way of acknowledging the mistreatment of those affected by the ban. So finally, as I draw to a close, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is delivering for defence, it is delivering for LGBT veterans.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend because I'm intervening because I've got to chair Westminster Hall in an hour's time and I can't take part in this debate. But my constituent not only lost his career in the Royal Air Force, but the abuse that he was subjected to when he was arrested, constant internal examinations. He was beaten, he was kicked, he was spat at, he was marched across the parade ground to his billet, and his personal belongings were gone through. The humiliation that they went through, was this sanctioned by the Ministry of Defence at the time? Who sanctioned it? Was it senior officers, or was it these individuals at the time working on their own? Because they were just sadistic animals towards my constituent, and something needs to be done to investigate that.
Well, my honourable friend has been one of the most consistent, most forceful voices for this historic abuse and the demands now for the government to provide some justice. I don't know whether his constituent, and he's raised that case in this House before over recent years, gave evidence to the Etherton Commission. If he did, he would have been one of over 1,100 individuals, LGBT veterans, who have served and had stories, often of the sort of abuse that my honourable friend talks about, to report to Etherton. It's based on that experience that Etherton made his recommendations. It's based on those recommendations that we make these announcements today, and it is from tomorrow that we will open the scheme to start assessing and then making payments that recognise that injustice. I'll give way and then I'll give way over there.
I thank the Secretary of State for making a really impassionate speech on this. My constituent, Ed Hall, who's in the chamber, was one of the founding members of the legal campaign to lift the ban. Ed was sacked from the Royal Navy for being gay in 1988, and he founded the first legal challenge group in 1994. When I met with him, he spoke about people who have been investigated, the humiliation, the stigma, and people who were sacked. Many were made homeless simply because of who they loved and their sexuality. Will the Minister join me in commending my constituent, Ed Hall, for his tireless work that helped to deliver this justice today for so many LGBT plus veterans? And as Ed said, a close to the shameful chapter in recent British military history.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very moving and powerful intervention there. And whilst there are courageous, relentless, energetic groups like Fighting with Pride that have in many ways led the charge, this was opened up by the stance of very courageous individuals like her constituent who had suffered but were prepared to speak out. Were prepared to speak out about their experience that was giving voice to the experience of many more. And the whole history of social change and progress in our country is based on brave individuals at the outset that won't stand for injustice, won't stand for that sort of harassment, will speak out and start the movement then that can bring pressure on governments and others to change. And so the case that she cites stands for a number of LGBT veterans, people who served this country and were not served well by our military at that time. And I hope her constituent and her constituent's family will welcome the announcement we're able to make today, and I hope that they will be able to take advantage of the schemes that we open up tomorrow. I give way.
I'm grateful for the Secretary of State giving way, and I welcome the tone and tenor of his statement today. But I wonder if he could assist the House in setting out the steps the government intends to take to ensure the reliability of gathering data as to the size of the cohort who will be affected by this and may be entitled to the compensation scheme.
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman makes a very sensible point, and the Shadow Defence Secretary will know, because he and his colleagues started this work before the election, that one of the, I would argue, the strengths of the announcement and the scheme we're able to put in place today is based on the very close work that we've done with veterans groups, with Fighting with Pride, as well as the work we've done to with historians and those who have access to records to make our best assessment of the number of veterans that may be affected, may be entitled, and may therefore want to take advantage of these financial recognition schemes. So we've set the budgets for these schemes. We've set the levels of award in light of that, and we'll see how that goes.
Will my right honourable friend give way?
I will indeed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to my honourable friend for giving way. I wholeheartedly welcome the announcement made by the Secretary of State this afternoon, particularly the additional funds that have been found to support charities who will help LGBT veterans with their applications. Because one of my constituents wrote to me with a most harrowing story about how his career in the armed forces ended with an investigation by the Royal Military Police. He said that every aspect of his life had been greatly affected since the initial investigation. His housing, employment, health and family life have all suffered as a result of the ban, which was ruled illegal in 1999. Can my right honourable friend outline to the House when eligible LGBT veterans impacted by the ban can expect to receive their financial recognition? Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, they can expect to be able to get the full details from 9 o'clock tomorrow. They can expect to be able to complete the details, respond to the information that's required from tomorrow. And I am very conscious that for many of these veterans, time is ticking, and I am determined that this is not a scheme that will take long to make its proper decisions, and so soon into the new year, LGBT veterans that are confirmed as eligible should expect payment. Madam Deputy Speaker, if that's... I look forward, by the way, to the large number of contributions in this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, but as I wind up, I want to emphasise 2 or 3 points. This is a government that is delivering for defence. This is a government that is delivering for LGBT veterans. And on behalf of the government, I want to apologise without reservation for the pain and the injustice caused during this dark chapter of our armed forces history. The treatment of LGBT veterans was a moral stain on our nation. It is shameful. It is shameful that those who put themselves in harm's way to defend our country were treated in such callous and unjust ways. And our government now will right those wrongs of the past. That's why we're providing the financial recognition to veterans. It's why we're making sure payments will be fair and proportionate and prompt. And it's why we're delivering on the remaining recommendations of the Etherton report. We will learn those lessons from that report. We will never forget the pain and trauma that LGBT veterans were subjected to between 1967 and 2000. We will root out any remaining prejudice and abuse wherever it rears its head in the forces. And we will look to build a more diverse, a stronger military that better reflects the society that it serves and protects. And a military in which everyone can serve without fearing injustice or discrimination. That's the One Nation mission this government is committed to. A modern, representative, unified armed forces, proud to keep Britain secure at home and strong abroad. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The question is that this House has considered Lord Etherton's independent review into the treatment of LGBT veterans. For the Shadow Secretary of State, James Cartlidge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to start by sincerely thanking Lord Etherton and his team for undertaking this hugely important review, commissioned under the previous government, now taken forward by the present one. Now, as in any situation like this, the financial quantum will come under scrutiny, but we on this side recognise the fact that the £75 million figure announced today is 50% above Lord Etherton's recommendations, and we support and welcome that. Now, in my ministerial or shadow roles, this is the first time I've spoken on the issue of homosexuality in the armed forces, not having had responsibility for veterans at the MOD, but I regard it as a great personal honour to be able to stand here and put on record my reflections as Shadow Secretary of State. First, to recognise the terrible pain, humiliation and degrading treatment experienced by far too many people who simply wanted one thing: to serve their country. Secondly, alongside the Secretary of State just now, to echo the previous Prime Minister, my right honourable friend from Richmond, and the former Secretary of State Ben Wallace in apologising unreservedly, given our position as a party in government for a significant part of the time that the ban remained in the military long after the law for the rest of the country had changed. Thirdly, that ultimately this is about recognising that the values of freedom, patriotism and public service are not confined to any part of society, but are common to all, and that we stand stronger as a nation and that our armed forces are best served if we recruit every talent from every possible walk of life. Madam Deputy Speaker, Lord Etherton has shone a bright light on a shameful historic wrong, and I am grateful to everyone who submitted a response to the call for evidence. Now, I appreciate that for every person affected, this will have been very difficult, dare I say traumatic, and it is why it was right that on the day Lord Etherton's report was published in July last year, speaking at Prime Minister's questions, my right honourable friend, the member for Richmond, said that the ban was an appalling failure of the British state. More.
Thank you. I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Earlier this year, a veteran from Belden in my constituency contacted me. Victoria served in the Women's Royal Army Corps but was dismissed due to her sexuality. She was subjected to imprisonment and mistreatment that many would consider abuse, and as a result, Victoria has suffered from PTSD for over 40 years. So I welcome today's announcement and the government's commitment to raise the compensation funds to 75 million, so veterans like Victoria get that. And I'm very pleased to hear the honourable gentleman, joining in that, and I would ask him to join me in welcoming today's historic announcement, and it completes the important work begun by the government opposite when they were in government to deliver on the recommendations of the Etherton review.
Well, I'm very grateful for the Honourable Lady, and I say to Victoria and all those who've experienced this firsthand, anyone who's read any of these testimonies, or dare I say experienced them or received them as constituency correspondence, like we heard from the Honourable Gentleman earlier for Eltham and Chislehurst. They are harrowing. They are harrowing to read. They must have been horrific to experience. And they are the people we have at the front of our mind as we debate this subject today. But I do agree with her. We welcome what the government has announced today, because as the report makes abundantly clear, the ban on LGBT people serving in the military saw brave service personnel face awful sexual abuse, violence, harassment and bullying. Lord Etherton's report also found that invasive investigations undertaken into individual sexuality caused long-lasting and severe impacts for some. The report found many veterans subjected to the ban developed mental health issues, including PTSD, experienced difficulty with their employment, finances, and, as we heard earlier, homelessness. Found it hard to form long-term relationships due to shame and trust issues, and perhaps inevitably some turned to alcohol and drugs. Compounding this, due to an absence of transition support, many veterans felt isolated, and tragically the stress caused by the ban means that we have lost LGBT veterans to suicide, and others have contemplated it. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, meeting campaigners, I was struck by one particularly powerful point, that what they want most of all is to feel a full and equal part of today's veterans' family. And as a House, I know we speak with one voice in saying to everyone affected, you are as much a veteran as anyone else who has served this country. Now, whilst even the financial packages announced today will not of themselves undo the past, it now means that both parties in government have taken significant steps to deliver redress. Important progress has been made in recent years to improve the experience of LGBT personnel, particularly in terms of training. And the Home Office's disregard and pardon scheme was also set up to ensure those who received a conviction for same-sex sexual offences can have that conviction wiped. And the Office of Veterans Affairs awarded £250,000 last year to LGBT organisations to provide support services for impacted veterans, and this was on top of the £45,000 provided in 2022 to help organisations gather evidence for this review that we're debating today. Obviously, in office, we launched the Etherton Review and accepted the intent behind each and every single one of Lord Etherton's recommendations. We were committed to implementing them in good time, we set deadlines and we made good progress, and will support the government as it concludes that work. We understand 39 of the 49 recommendations have been delivered. The Veterans Minister is welcome to correct me in his wind-up, but if he could provide clarity on the timeline for delivering the remaining recommendations, I'm sure we would all welcome that. And I know from all the work my right honourable friend for South West Wiltshire, the previous Veterans Minister, put into this, that it was never going to be straightforward coming up with a deliverable package of financial compensation. As my honourable friend for Solihull West and Shirley said in his intervention, there is the crucial issue of gathering data, so it's complicated. That being so, I welcome the two-pronged scheme approach, and in particular the fact that payments will be exempt from income tax, although I believe this does mean we are linked in timing to the delivery of the finance bill. My understanding is that those affected will be able to apply under this dismissed or discharged payment cohort from tomorrow, but that inevitably the impact cohort will take longer due to the involvement of the independent panel, and I would urge ministers to keep us posted on how the scheme works in practice. As the Secretary of State said, time is ticking and we all want to see this resolved and money awarded as soon as possible. Madam Deputy Speaker, we fully support the plans to restore rank and amend official reasons for discharge, and would ask the Minister to clarify on the timing on when those affected will be able to commence such a process, and request that to take place. Finally, I want to pay tribute to all colleagues who have campaigned on this issue, as many have, with passion and persistence, and also to those in the last government for their work getting us here, particularly Ben Wallace, Johnny Mercer, and the previous Veterans Minister, my right honourable friend, Member for South West Wiltshire. And finally, and in particular, I'd like to pay tribute to Craig Jones, Caroline Page and Ed Hall of Fighting with Pride for their extraordinary effort to campaign, raise awareness and deliver this change. They have helped to ensure that a tangible righting of a deep wrong is now happening in practice, underscoring the equal place for people of all backgrounds in our veterans community and in our armed forces.
Members will be able to see that there are a large number wishing to contribute to a very important debate this afternoon. I have no plans as yet to put a time limit on, but perhaps members might be respectful with the number of interventions they take. Chris Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I warmly welcome the debate today? And can I also thank the Defence Secretary and the Veterans Minister for the way they've gone about this. working with LGBT veterans, building on the work of the previous government, and working with charities such as Fighting with Pride. I know the Defence Secretary and the Veterans Minister care deeply about this. The Defence Secretary rightly said this was unfinished business for Labour, and the Veterans Minister assured me when I first raised this with him many months ago that this will be up and running by the end of the year, so we can put that under the promises kept part of the government's record, and I'm very grateful for that. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a profound injustice, a moral stain on the nation, as the Defence Secretary rightly said a few moments ago. Thousands of servicemen and women over many decades were interrogated, persecuted and punished for their sexuality. People who only wanted to serve our nation, but were let down by them in the most profound way. People like a constituent of mine in Brighton, Kemptown and Peacehaven, who told me that he felt, and I quote, washed in shame at the way he was discharged, imprisoned and discarded by the RAF, despite his exemplary service record. Now, there are thousands more veterans who fall into that bracket, some of whom we've already heard about this afternoon and hopefully we'll hear more about. These people who lost their career, their pay, their pension, and often their family and their friends, but also their sense of self. I think the opposition spokesperson said this as well, a sense of self, of value, of belonging. And the emotional, psychological and physical impact of this is still being understood as we go through it. And Madam Deputy Speaker, that's the central point of this debate today and the injustice we face. How do we ever go about rectifying something on such a scale? Harder still, how do we put a value on it and a process around it? So I want to thank Lord Etherton for all his work over this over many years, and to recognise that the Veterans Secretary and the Defence Secretary have worked incredibly hard building on the last government to deliver this. The financial recognition scheme set up tomorrow is hugely welcome. I know that will be welcomed by veterans in my constituency and across the country. I will be trying to do everything I can to encourage the many LGBT veterans in my constituency to apply for it. I hope other members will, and I know the Defence Secretary will. I also welcome the increase in funding that's been allocated. A 50% increase is not insignificant. It's a significant commitment from this government, and I welcome it. I also welcome the creation of two clear funding schemes. First, for those with formal discharge and dismissal, but second, and really importantly, for many who never suffered that, but suffered much wider loss, emotional, financial and physical, that many members have spoken about. As the Defence Secretary said, it's also incredibly important that today the option of restoring rank and removing the record of discharge is being brought forward as well. That's a point many LGBT veterans I have met in my constituency surgeries and around Brighton Kemptown have raised, that is in some senses as important as the financial measures announced, so I welcome that. But I would welcome clarity on a couple of points, if I may be so bold. First, what estimate has the MOD made of the number of people who are likely to apply for each of the two tranches under the scheme? And what estimate have they made of what the average payments are likely to be? Now, I know no two cases are the same. The Defence Secretary mentioned that in an intervention earlier. And of course, the headline figure of 70,000 is very welcome. But how many people does the Minister and the Secretary of State believe will ever receive that? And how many are likely to fall into those two tranches? I'd welcome some clarity on that. Also, how does the Minister respond to the concern that by keeping a hard cap on compensation, albeit a significantly increased one, that many applicants will ultimately end up receiving quite low sums, particularly given the level of injustice that we've all stated? Also, the 2-year period on applications. Can the Minister just explain why there's a 2-year cap on that and what the government will be doing to make sure that all those who are eligible will come forward and will be able to apply? Because, as we know, and we've all heard from looking at this over many months, that many people are only just willing to come forward on this issue, and this might take much more time to reach the many people who suffered injustice. So I'm slightly concerned on the 2-year cap, but I'd welcome some clarity on that. Conscious of time, Madam Deputy Speaker, but look, I know there's a lot of work to do now to get these schemes up and running, to get the conversation out as quickly as possible. Today is an incredibly welcome step on that journey. But as we've heard, it has been a very long journey for many people, decades in the making, and time is running out to get justice delivered. But above all, I want to thank those who've made that journey possible, especially the extraordinary LGBT veterans I've had the pleasure of meeting in the last 5 months, and Fighting with Pride, who have done so much for so many to achieve so much progress that we hear today. Thank you.
Before I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, I'm just going to make the point it is imperative that members be present for the opening statements of any debate if they wish to get called, perhaps particularly so for the front benches. Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today we're here to discuss the implementation of the recommendations laid out in Lord Etherton's independent review into the treatment of LGBT veterans. These recommendations follow the unjust and appalling treatment of LGBT plus veterans who served in our armed forces under the shadow of a discriminatory and dehumanising ban. This is not just a matter of historical injustice, but an ongoing fight for dignity, recognition and fairness for those who gave so much to our country and were repaid with shameful betrayal. We should also today recognise all those who served before 1967 and the injustice that they received before this time. Between 1967 and 2000, thousands of LGBT plus personnel were dismissed or forced out of the military simply because of who they were. The anti-gay ban had and continues to have an enormous impact on people's lives. Careers were destroyed, lives upended and futures taken away. LGBT plus veterans were outed to their friends and family without their consent, facing extreme stigma. Not only did they lose their jobs, they also had their medals removed and were stripped of their pensions. In some cases, a conviction has made it impossible for people to move on and rebuild their lives due to the barriers a criminal record creates when trying to find employment. It's indefensible that those who put their lives on the line for our country should continue to be treated with disregard. The independent review by Lord Etherton laid bare the devastating impact of this discriminatory policy on LGBT plus veterans and made 49 recommendations to address these wrongs. While progress has been made, it remains far from complete. The Government must ensure that all the review's recommendations are acted upon as swiftly and comprehensively as possible. Let me share two harrowing examples from constituents of my colleagues that illustrate the enduring trauma caused by this policy. This morning I met with Michael Sampson, who sits in the gallery today, a constituent of Monica Harding MP. He joined the Royal Air Force.
As a front bench spokesman, the Honourable Lady A should be on the bench when I'm on my feet, but we mustn't refer to colleagues by name in the House. The Honourable Lady, I believe, is the member for Epsom and Ewell? No, Esher. But please, Helen Maguire.
My apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker. He joined the Royal Air Force at just 16 years old, filled with pride and ambition. He served with distinction for 5 years before his life was shattered in 1992. After innocently sharing details about attending London clubs, Michael became the target of a covert investigation. His barracks were searched in a humiliating manner, exposing deeply personal items such as a romantic letter. He was extensively and inappropriately questioned about his personal life, offered electroconversion therapy, and underwent what at the time was described as a medical examination, but would today be called sexual assault. Ultimately, Michael was charged with homosexuality and detained for 14 days before his discharge, during which he was subjected to cruel physical and verbal abuse. Following his discharge, Michael lost not only his career but also his home and his sense of purpose. He was left homeless, battling severe depression and rejection from his family. Despite his immense contributions to lifting the military ban, Michael continues to struggle with the deep scars of his past. He now seeks justice for himself and others who endured similar horrors. The current compensation scheme, cap at £70,000, is an inadequate acknowledgement of the profound harm suffered by individuals like Michael. Michael said to me he was proud to serve his country and his country was ashamed of him. David, a constituent of the member for Guildford, also served in the RAF during the 1980s, fulfilling a lifelong dream. Yet his career was marred by persistent rumours, bullying and verbal abuse. Despite never being charged, he was subject to constant surveillance and intimidation. After years of enduring shame and distress, David left the RAF following an interview with his commanding officer, who bluntly stated that there was no place for him in this man's RAF. To add insult to injury, David had to buy his way out of the RAF. He spent years unable to live openly as himself and has faced diminished career prospects and a significant impacted pension. Like Michael, David finds the proposed compensation deeply disappointing and urges the Government to reconsider its approach. Madam Deputy Speaker, these stories are not isolated incidents. They represent a systematic failure that affected thousands of LGBT plus veterans. Lord Etherton's review revealed the immense toll that this policy took on mental health, with 87% of LGBT plus veterans reporting that their dismissal impacted their mental health and 75% stating that their finances have been affected. The Government has accepted 38 of the 49 recommendations made in the Lord Etherton's review and acknowledged that, and it's also acknowledged the need for compensation. And I'm pleased that the total compensation scheme budget has now been increased. However, the flat cap of £50,000 for dismissed or discharged applicants is inadequate. Veterans' charities have rightly called this inadequate and unacceptably low. For individuals who lost their careers, their homes and their futures, it's a small offering. Justice demands better. It's unconscionable that veterans like Michael and David are left fighting for recognition and fairness after already enduring so much. And the LGBT impact payment of between £1,000 and £20,000 is also unacceptably low for what one veteran described as state-sanctioned sexual assault. The Liberal Democrats are unequivocal in our stance. LGBT plus veterans deserve full and fair compensation for the harm they suffered. We call on the Government to reassess the compensation scheme, ensuring that it truly reflects the gravity of the injustices endured. We welcome the 4 non-financial measures outlined by the Minister today for veterans who served before 1967. However, it's vital that all 49 recommendations of the Etherton Review are implemented swiftly and comprehensively. This includes the return of medals, clarification of pension rights, and the establishment of a memorial to honour LGBT plus veterans. Justice delayed is justice denied, and the Government must expedite support for elderly or ill veterans, such as Joe Usalis, who served with distinction for 18 years but now fears he may die before seeing justice. Joe deserves to have suitable compensation swiftly. He gave his life to serve our country and asked very little in return. This debate also reminds us that discrimination in the armed forces has not been limited to LGBT plus personnel. The 2021 Atherton report highlighted the pervasive challenges faced by women in the military, including bullying, harassment and sexual assault. 62% of female veterans reported experiencing some form of abuse during their service. Such systematic issues are unacceptable and undermine the very values of our armed forces are meant to uphold. We must ensure that the recommendations of the Atherton report are fully implemented and that diversity, inclusion and respect become cornerstones of military culture. In conclusion, the armed forces represent the best of our nation. They are made up of individuals who have pledged to protect us, often at great personal cost. For too long, LGBT plus veterans were denied the respect and recognition they deserved, and it's time to right this wrong. The Liberal Democrats stand firmly with our LGBT plus veterans. We'll continue to fight for fair compensation, the implementation of all recommendations from the Etherton and Atherton reports, and a culture of inclusivity in the armed forces. Let us honour the sacrifices of these brave individuals by delivering justice swiftly. Thank you.
Elaine Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank the Secretary of State for giving an update to the House today. I would also like to thank him for showing a clear understanding of the hurt and pain suffered by the LGBT veterans over the years. It is important to acknowledge that no amount of financial compensation will ever wipe the painful memories away. However, these are clear steps for cleaning the stain our nation these violations have caused. The failure to get this right, as Lord Etherton says in his independent report, risks prolonging the sense of injustice rather than achieving closure. Of course, this debate goes beyond financial redress. It's about correcting an injustice lived by veterans that lost their livelihoods and their place in society. It's about acting to repair long-lasting damage that cost many men and women their physical and mental health. It's about giving people back their sense of pride and freedom. They defended our freedoms while we were denying their own. One individual is a constituent of mine who I sat with in November when he explained the very real horrors he suffered. Joined the Navy in October 1979, shortly before his 17th birthday. Originally trained as a naval airman and then later as a marine engineer. In 1982, after 3 years in service, he was accosted in the middle of the night by 4 military police, placed in a blackout van and taken to the Royal Navy Hospital, Stonehouse. There he was forced to strip and was subjected to what he calls an invasive medical procedure, carried out by Royal Navy doctors. In front of an audience of military police, this physical abuse was just the start. With his uniform given to forensics, he was issued a dirty dressing gown, driven to a cell block and placed in a strip cell. He encountered silent guards, he was given his meals on the floor, he was accompanied to the toilet and to the showers. The silence continued for 3 days. He was never offered any legal advice nor any legal representation. He was interrogated several times by senior officials who told him that they saw him as a threat to other servicemen because of his homosexuality. He was told he would be denied until such times as he believed for it safe to release him. He was not charged with any offence, nor was he aware or when he would be released. For 20 days he was consigned to a strip cell with the light permanently on and silent guards banned from talking to him. During that time, his father contacted the Ministry of Defence in London to tell my constituent that his sister, who had leukaemia, was now being kept on a life support machine. His father wanted to give him his chance to say goodbye. His father was told he was at the sea. When he was released into custody, the regulating branch of HMS Drake was told his sister had passed away. Months went by. Whilst not detained, he was classed as an offender at large. On the 28th of March 1983, without warning, every available rating officer on duty in the HMS Drake was ordered to gather in the gym. He, alongside others who had been previously detained for being homosexual, were ordered to dress in full uniform. They were marched into the gym. There, in front of an audience of hundreds, an officer with a sword stood in front of him and removed his cap. The captain of HMS Drake read out numerous charges in full graphic detail, charges that had never been put to him. His description of the shouts and insults and threats from a baying crowd was actually awful to listen to. No attempt was made to silence the crowd. He was then dismissed from the service with immediate effect. He was handed his civilian clothes. He was dumped on the streets of Plymouth, far from his home, with £54 to his name. The long-lasting effects of this experience, in his words, were catastrophic. Drugs and alcohol addiction plagued his life for almost 30 years, a vicious cycle of precarious work and unemployment. At this point, I want to quote directly from him. "I carried with me a sense of great shame, not only for being gay, seen as a criminal still in the armed forces, but sometimes you were also forced to declare you had been dismissed from the armed forces every time you applied for work. Further to this, I spent 30 years of self-destruction, believed that I deserved the treatment that I received for being caught, and as such blamed myself for the mess my life had become. Only 30 years later, he has been able to recover with a sense of pride, self-worth and self-confidence. He subsequently went to university, gained his first-class honours degree in English literature and creative writing, recently obtained a master in research, a research degree in English literature both at University of Chester. This is just a snapshot of a small part of the physical and mental health impacts that the LGBT ban had on his life. This is an opportunity to bring an honourable end to this dishonourable attack against members of our own armed forces. The way the LGBT armed forces personnel were treated does not reflect today's armed forces. I welcome the fact that Lord Etherton and the Ministry of Defence have worked together with an incredible community of veterans to achieve this announcement today. Finally, I urge the Government to continue to work with the community to promote this scheme and to ensure that every veteran affected by the ban receives the compensation they deserve. Thank you.
Might be helpful if I provide a small business update to Honourable and Right Honourable members. The second debate that was scheduled for this afternoon will now not go ahead, which gives this very important debate the full time up until 5 o'clock, which will certainly enable me to get all members in. John Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Soon many of us will be held wrapped by television's SAS Rogue Heroes, which returns to screens soon. The series will focus on the elite unit as, back from initial success in the Desert War, they face the much sterner challenge of Ayrshire, where they were briefly based until they went into action in Italy and occupied Europe. With the legendary founder David Stirling languishing in Colditz, the focus will be on the new commanding officer, Blair Paddy Mayne. Mayne should, by rights, have been decorated with the Victoria Cross, our Premier Gallantry Award, for his action rescuing pinned-down troops in Oldenburg, Germany in 1945. Yet, the award was downgraded. This was perhaps because of Mayne's enthusiastic off-duty drinking and his penchant for punching senior officers. But it might also have to do with the suggestion that he was a homosexual. It is quite remarkable that such a martial giant should be doomed to be the bravest man who never won a VC over something so entirely irrelevant. Yet today we must confront the reality that outmoded views of LGBT people persisted in the military for far longer than they ought to have. And while nothing can be done now to right the wrong done to Blair Mayne, this government is addressing the suffering of people very much alive today. Take my Dumfries and Galloway constituent Alan, once a teenager, proud to serve in RAF Blue. He told me, arrested for being gay, I was sexually assaulted by the Special Investigation Branch and made to endure horrific, humiliating treatment during a gruelling 3-day interview. As an 18-year-old kid, I lost all contact with my family and attempted to take my life 5 times due to the way I was treated. The long-term effect this has had on my mental health and family connections has not been easy. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government is in a position to deliver that thing that veterans such as both Blair Mayne and my constituent Alan would recognise as vital to all military operations: speed. We've heard the clock is ticking, time is moving on, and the gallant and right honourable gentleman opposite who will sum up is no stranger to combat, but he may yet find the Treasury a difficult opponent on the timings here. He may need the courage of Mayne to prevail in that struggle, and we all must hope that this scheme is streamlined and delivered at a pace in perhaps a way that the Post Office Horizon compensation system was not. Thank you.
Tom Rutland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you to colleagues across the Chamber for the many compelling and moving speeches that we've heard so far today. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I made my maiden speech in this Chamber during the general debate on remembrance, I spoke of the bravery and personal sacrifice of all of those who have served and continue to serve our country in our armed forces. When reading the testimonies of veterans in this review who have relived their trauma, pain and suffering in the pursuit of justice, we are once again reminded of that bravery and personal sacrifice, and that there can be no doubt in anyone's mind that they belonged in our armed forces, and in banning them, we did a great disservice to them and to our country.
Yeah.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the policy to ban LGBT people from serving is rightly referred to as a stain on the history of the UK's armed forces. But the evidence of the culture of homophobia, bullying, blackmail, sexual assaults, abusive and humiliating investigations, medical examinations as if being gay was a disease to be remedied, goes beyond a mere stain and is, at its very mildest, a shameful and reprehensible chapter in our history. These are people who wanted to serve their country, who did serve their country, and yet all their country served them was a P45, dismissing or discharging them not based on their performance, but based on who they are. And although after a dreadfully long 33 years this policy was eventually lifted, we know, like many abuses, that our LGBT veterans, the victims of this policy, have suffered appalling consequences for the rest of their lives. And that is what makes this review and this debate so important, as we must recognise that these aren't dark tales of times gone by, but that this injustice is still having a real effect on people to this very day. People like my constituent Chris, who bravely gave evidence to Lord Etherton's review board about his own dismissal in 1984, who came to one of my first constituency surgeries and moved me almost to tears, and who I was proud to march alongside in this year's Remembrance Sunday parade. Chris served in Northern Ireland. He volunteered for the Falklands. He received an Air Officer Commanding's commendation. He gained promotion to corporal on his return to the UK, and whilst originally enlisted for 6 years, he had aspirations of serving our country, of serving his country, for much longer. But once Chris's secret was out, and after 6 months of not knowing what was going to happen to him, during which he was placed in the psychiatric wing of a military hospital, medicated daily, was considered a security threat and investigated by the SIB. He was dishonourably discharged despite a glowing report of his service career, booted out and left to fend for himself with no support as he grappled with the rapid transition to civilian life, financial hardship and suicidal thoughts. In meetings and correspondence with me, Chris has talked of his pride in being a member of the armed forces, the love he had for the Air Force, and that when his secret was out, it wasn't just his career that was dashed, but his life too. And that point is important. This injustice wasn't just a career setback, but something that ruined lives, that took away time and opportunity that can never be given back. And whilst we're thankfully a different country today, in no small part due to the last Labour government lifting the ban, it is right that we address the wrongs of the past. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I must therefore turn to the subject of compensation. No amount of money can undo the wrongs of the past, but I'm delighted that the government has announced a 50% increase in the total compensation fund from 50 million to 75 million, with those affected able to receive up to £70,000 and a flat rate of £50,000 for all those eligible for the LGBT dismissed or discharged payment. I will.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Veterans who suffered from this abhorrent abuse, like my own constituent who's up in the gallery today, suffered the most shocking accounts of brutal rape and assault and bravely want their story told. Does the honourable member agree with me that funds should be allocated among the victims based on the severity of their case as a small recompense to the vast horrors that they've had to endure and psychologically continue to?
I agree with the honourable member. When referring to previous cases and the range of amounts awarded, the review itself says, and I quote, "An amount which falls below that range risks prolonging a sense of injustice rather than achieving closure, and I'm glad that our government is not taking that risk." Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm also glad to see the government's recognition that some veterans impacted by the ban are seriously unwell, and it is right that those individuals will be prioritised, and that money is being set aside to fund key charities to support LGBT veterans with their applications, which can be submitted from tomorrow. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is also not just about money, but about the pride of service too. And with many LGBT veterans having had their ranks taken away and been dishonourably discharged, I wholeheartedly welcome today's announcement that ranks will be restored and discharge reasons amended so that they reflect and honour the service of our impacted veterans. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to add a personal remark of my own. As a citizen of this great country, I know that the freedoms and opportunities that I enjoy have been secured by the bravery and sacrifice of our armed forces. And as a gay man, I know that the rights that I can almost take for granted were hard fought for and hard won by those who went before me, who spoke up against injustice and campaigned for change, often at great personal cost and often with the knowledge that they may never know, experience or benefit from the change and the future that they spent their lives working towards. Today is a chance to thank both of those groups and recognise that they are not distinct but overlapping, because there have always been people like Chris, gay and serving their country. Chris served his country with pride at a time when his country was not proud to take him for who he was. Today, he can hear his Member of Parliament and so many other MPs say, "We are proud, we are thankful, and we are sorry."
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As we've heard today, it's almost extraordinary now in 2024 to think that for so long the UK Armed Forces upheld a ban on LGBT+ personnel. This ban allowed for the legal discharge of LGBT+ individuals from their duties. In some cases, this meant people were criminally prosecuted. LGBT+ veterans were outed to their families and friends without their consent, forced to endure stigma and discrimination. They lost their jobs and had their medals and their pensions taken from them. In some cases, these individuals were criminally convicted simply for being themselves. This has made it nearly impossible for them to rebuild their lives, facing significant barriers in finding employment and moving forward. My constituent, Stephen Purves from Haywards Heath, is among the thousands who were so deeply wronged. Stephen was the last RAF officer to go to prison for being gay. He served. Indeed, endured, Madam Deputy Speaker, 6 months in a civilian prison. He did so solely as a result of being himself. To add insult to injury, Stephen was stripped of his pension. He was court-martialled and dismissed in disgrace from the RAF in 1985. He should have received a pension from 38. He did not. Financially, he was left in ruins. He has had to work far harder to make ends meet ever since. This financial insecurity, coupled with the difficulty of finding employment with a criminal conviction, is just one of the reasons he was also left mentally scarred. He tells me these scars remain. He has been left to battle with the mental health repercussions of this scandal for decades. As well as the obvious and severe stresses and strains of the financial situation he was left in, he has endured stigmatisation, isolation and social exclusion. It is indefensible that those who served our country, put their lives on the line for our safety and freedom, were treated in this way. My Liberal Democrat colleagues and I are committed to ensuring that LGBT+ veterans receive the justice they deserve. This absolutely includes guaranteeing fair compensation for every veteran impacted. I welcome the increased compensation announced today, but I'm sorry to say that I don't think the maximum award of £70,000 is sufficient, given other compensation schemes already announced by the government for things like Horizon. And I don't think it's sufficient for someone like Steve, who lost his career, his liberty, went bankrupt and suffers to this day. I close by urging the government to go further. Thank you.
Dan Aldridge.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In the 1980s, aged 18, my constituent Robert moved from Scotland to sunny Weston-super-Mare to pursue a bright career at RAF Locking, then a vital part of the RAF's technical training, radio and radar network. However, not so long after moving to Weston, Robert was questioned by the Special Investigations Branch about being a practising homosexual. Very soon after this, his career in the RAF was over, and the shame and embarrassment cast a long and powerful shadow over the rest of his life. Robert was unable to return to Scotland because of the hostility and rejection associated with being gay. After being treated so terribly by the state he was working so hard to protect, it took Robert a long time to be able to live a happy, healthy and fulfilled life. Like so many gay people over many generations, moving away from the home and family we were born into was a way of finding acceptance, or at least anonymity, and an escape from judgment and shame. For Robert, like so many others, myself included, Weston-super-Mare is a place of sanctuary and healing. Our town looks after people, and I'm very proud of that. Over the past decade, the RAF and our other armed forces have become international beacons of inclusion, demonstrating that who we are is no barrier to serving our country. Today's announcement is a profound statement of who we are as a country, and importantly reminds us that we are stronger and better defended because of this openness and candour. There are, however, some things which only a government can and should do. The independent review by Lord Etherton is a powerful move towards justice, and so many are grateful to him for his diligence and compassion. Today's announcement follows this government's commitments to the victims of contaminated blood and the post office scandals. These are profound acts by the state to apologise and rebuild trust with those who have waited far too long for fair treatment. I'm grateful for the Defence Secretary, the Veterans Minister, for the charity Fighting with Pride and the work of the previous government to right this wrong. And I am hopeful the thousands of veterans affected, including my constituent Robert in Weston, will receive meaningful justice. Thank you.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start, like the front benches have done, with an apology. I'm sorry that anyone had to go through this. And as has been said, the money, the compensation, does not make up for the treatment that they received. It does not fix the situation. It still happened. And I'm pleased to hear the recognition and acceptance that this happened and it should never have happened from everyone who has spoken so far. I want to talk a little bit about some of the speeches that have been made, but also I've got a number of questions for the Minister in relation to the compensation scheme. I did listen very carefully to the Secretary of State when he introduced and talked about how the scheme is going to work. My understanding from what he said, and I may be wrong, it would be helpful for clarity from the Minister, was that there will be two pots, if you like. There will be a pot of 50,000, a flat payment for those people who were dismissed or discharged, or the words the Secretary of State used, I think, were instructed to leave. A little bit more clarity around what instructed to leave would be helpful. Whether people were sat down and told you must resign, does that count as an instruction? Or is it only if they were formally given a letter that said you must resign? Where is the bar there, and how will that be judged for that flat payment of the £50,000? In relation to the other payments, the Secretary of State seemed to suggest that it was for two different things. Both those people who had suffered additional hardships in addition to the discharge, for example, those that were imprisoned, those that suffered additional discrimination. But I wasn't sure if it was also open to those people who had not been discharged but did suffer through discrimination as a result of their sexuality. Does it do those two purposes of both being a top-up payment and a payment of recompense for those who had more minor suffering than a discharge? So it would be helpful to get some clarity on that. In relation to some other questions around the scheme, the 2-year time period has been mentioned, and I appreciate the government does have to have some sort of time period in order to ensure that people know when the closing date is. It'd be helpful if the government would commit to undertaking some sort of review at maybe the 1-year point to ensure that it is going as intended, that as many people have applied to it and that the process has been going smoothly, in order to say, actually, we do think 2 years is an adequate amount of time because, we reckon that 90% of people have applied for it in the first year, or that we don't reckon 2 years is an appropriate amount of time, and therefore we think we should maybe increase that length of time in order to ensure that everybody who's entitled to this compensation can get that compensation. I wondered if those people who are currently overseas will be able to apply. A number of people have, as was mentioned by the member from Brighton Kemptown, who talked about people losing their sense of self, have, like the member from Weston-super-Mare said, fled, had to leave because they want to leave behind the trauma, and maybe therefore overseas as a result of, as a direct or indirect result of the treatment that they received. Will they still be able to apply to the compensation scheme and to receive compensation no matter where they're currently staying? In terms of the charitable support as well that is being provided, can the Minister just give me some assurances that that charitable support will ensure a geographic spread, so that, for example, if there are charities that only work in England, that there are other charities that are also being funded so that they can provide support to veterans in other parts of these islands. I know that, for example, Citizens Advice Bureau in Aberdeen has got something like a 14-week wait at the moment for people to be able to get any advice, and therefore, although it's a national charity, it has differential waiting times in different places. So a kind of acknowledgement or understanding from the Minister that he will look at whether or not that charitable support that's being provided does have that geographic spread and is ensuring that everybody can get the help and support that they need. I want to go back to the comments about people's self and their sense of self and what they lost as a result of either being discharged or for life being made so difficult for them that they could no longer remain in the armed forces. I think the speech from the member from Carrick and Cumnock laying out the trauma that her constituent went through was immensely powerful and echoes the views of the evidence that was given to the review, as it was undertaken. It is very difficult for us sitting here to listen to that. Never mind for all of those people that had to go through those horrific experiences. People lost not just a career, not just their standing in the community, not just something they may have dreamed of, but some part of themselves when they were told you cannot both be a soldier and be gay. And, you know, people who had dreamed forever of going into the armed forces and had believed and had served with incredible bravery and honour, to then be told, we don't want you. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. But would the honourable member agree with me that it's not just, as you say, the loss of job and pension, but also that loss of shared value and the rejection felt that they could no longer do things that other veterans were able to do together? But I wonder whether you've got any thoughts about those members. You talk about people who left and fled the country, but there are constituents like Karen in my constituency of Mid Dorset North Pool who were betrayed by another LGBT personnel because they wanted to protect themselves. They were able to protect their own discharge by betraying somebody else. I wonder if she has any thoughts on that.
I don't think it's my place to comment on the individuals who perpetrated some of the abuses that were seen, or whether or not there was a kind of systemic matter in this, or whether there was kind of personal gain was received out of any of this. I do understand that people want redress for that and want to and I think the Minister has recognised that above and beyond the pot of money that is related specifically for the discharge, there is this additional pot for additional hardships that have been faced. One of my constituents is in touch with me about the fact that he had intended to be in the armed forces for life. That was what his plan was. He had never wanted to do anything else. That was his aim, was to be a member of the armed forces. And when he was ejected from there, his hopes and dreams and his sense of self were all gone from him. And recovering from that trauma is incredibly difficult. I do appreciate the work that the Minister and the Secretary of State have done, and the previous government as well, in order to ensure that this has come forward. And I do appreciate that the amount of money in the pot has been increased in order to provide the compensation. As I say, I've asked those specific questions. I just wanted to raise the issue there about the veterans' family, the family of veterans. And I think it's incredibly important that the follow-through happens here. So previously, when the medals were sent out to some of the LGBT veterans, they were posted and appeared through the door, in the letterbox, through the normal post, falling onto the carpet with their bills from BT and their energy supplier. You know, I don't think that was an appropriate recognition, and was not in a way that other people would have received their medals. So I think more could be done to ensure that it's not just warm words about being part of the veterans' family, it's reality, and that people are provided with that welcome, as well as told they will be provided with that welcome and remain part of that family. So I want to say thank you to the Minister, and thank you to everybody who's come forward today. I want to thank all of those organisations that have been fighting for this, all of the individuals that have been fighting for this. And I want also to thank those who have not been brave enough to tell their story, who are going through such difficult times that they're not able to do so. Those who are in the gallery today have been able to give voice on behalf of themselves, but also on behalf of their friends, their colleagues, who are not able to tell their stories to us today or to the review. So I thank them for being that voice for the community, and I hope that the Minister is able to answer some of those questions in order to ensure that this compensation scheme does work as the government intends and does give an amount of recompense for the extreme trauma and suffering that people have been through.
Julia Buckley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the opportunity to speak today in this important debate, and I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement that, in response to the Etherton review, into the treatment of LGBT veterans, that these additional amounts of compensation will be offered to all victims, and the second tiered payment for those most severely affected. This is most welcome, but this is so very late, and this will never be enough to compensate our LGBT veterans for the treatment they suffered while trying to serve our armed forces and the abandonment they felt once they had left. As Craig Jones wrote in the book Serve with Pride, which shares some of the tragic stories of LGBT lives blighted by the shameful period of military history, I quote, "With quiet dignity most have endured, these are veterans deserving of our compassion for the adversity they have faced and the courage they have shown, all while waiting to be heard and acknowledged. After all they have been through, it is quite remarkable that for most, their loyalty to the armed forces has endured, and still today, many simply seek acceptance and recognition amongst their comrades. Today, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to tell the story of a brave and committed soldier that I had the honour to meet. My constituent is a veteran from 50 years ago, and who carried the heavy burden of shame of being dismissed from the services for being who they are, rather than being thanked for all that they did. Gunner Ashton joined the Royal Artillery in 1969, became the best small arms shot, and served in Germany defending us from the Cold War threat, and achieved top technical rating as a surveyor. And being tipped for promotion, spent 4 months in Northern Ireland at the border under the Falls Road in Belfast. He was shot at, bombed at, and saw his comrades fall. Such bravery and courage, such distinguished service and commitment, such capability and achievement. May I place on record the pride and recognition that Gunner Ashton so richly deserves. However, Gunner Ashton served 3 years before being medically discharged. So ex-Gunner Ashton disappeared back up north into obscurity, not ever knowing he was a victim of the gay ban, not knowing he was a veteran, and certainly never being thanked for his service. What a sad end to a promising career, and a sad indictment of the armed forces' disgraceful treatment of our LGBT officers at that time. Well, I'm glad to say that is not the end of this story. Gunner Ashton was courageous enough to seek help to become Claire Ashton, the same kind, compassionate and capable person that she has always been. When I met with her in our constituency, I was immediately impressed with her dignified approach, her thorough and detailed account, her excellent service record, and her steely determination to seek recognition for the thousands of her comrades who had suffered this injustice and deserve our recognition. Finally, after 50 years, ex-Gunner Ashton heard the Prime Minister apologise to our LGBT officers last year and launched the reparations and compensation scheme. Finally, Claire received her Veterans Identity Card and a small Veterans Badge. Finally, ex-Gunner Ashton was recognised as a veteran and for her remarkable contribution to the artillery. Claire joined the ex-service organisation that supports LGBT personnel fighting with pride, and was given the honour of carrying their standard at last year's Royal British Legion Festival of Remembrance at the Royal Albert Hall in front of the King and Queen and amongst 50 veterans from that organisation, standing shoulder to shoulder with thousands of our other veterans. But Claire's finest hour was when, wearing her small veteran's badge at the cenotaph, a passerby noticed the badge and said simply, "Thank you for your service." That was the first person to do so. This had taken 51 years. I would like to be the second person to thank her for her service and to ask that it be recorded in the Houses of Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, Claire Ashton is here today, having travelled on the train at 5 a.m. this morning from Shrewsbury. She's up in the gallery to watch this debate, and I hope that she feels the respect and admiration of this House for her contribution to our armed forces, as well as our earnest endeavours to put right this terrible wrong. I asked Claire Ashton if she had a message for the Minister and for this House. She asks that we understand, in order to recruit and retain good recruits for our armed forces, we need to treat our veterans with the dignity and respect that they deserve. Serving personnel will ask, what future do I have in our forces? New recruits will hesitate if they do not feel welcome. We have an opportunity to learn the lessons from the past and ensure that strong recruits and excellent officers are supported and nurtured to reach their full potential and thrive in our armed forces. It is a matter of fundamental welfare for serving personnel and veterans to feel safe and valued. And Claire Ashton will have the last word because she reminds us that is all we want, to feel valued.
Sean Berry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard some very, very powerful stories today, and it's not every day that my constituency surgeries lead me to well up. I'm normally as hard as nails, but I recently had the pleasure of meeting with Craig Jones, MBE, one of the founders of Fighting with Pride, and he talked so powerfully about his own story and other veterans' stories of pain and injustice, but also honour and pride, and it was really deeply moving to speak with him. During our meeting, that word honour came up time after time as Craig described his LGBTQ+ colleagues in the armed forces who suffered so much under the ban, which we must reflect on today, was only lifted in the year 2000. And in the period before that, thousands and thousands of LGBTQ+ service personnel were removed or forced from service. Many, as we've heard, were physically or sexually abused. Craig told me that many of his colleagues felt washed in shame because of what happened to them. In those days, simply admitting you were gay was dangerous and had far-reaching consequences that we must compensate for today. Although homosexuality was decriminalised for civilians in 1967, it wasn't only a ban in the armed forces, it remained a criminal offence. These people faced imprisonment. We have to compensate fully for that. Now, Craig described to me moving to Brighton and our city as the only place where he and his partner felt safe. And on the day that the ban was lifted, he came out as gay, and after a few more years left the forces, helped find Fighting with Pride, took part in that excellent campaigning which led to the Etherton review and the actions we're pleased to welcome today. But I don't think this is finished. As other members have said, the financial scheme is absolutely crucial. It must compensate fully. Now, it appears that Lord Etherton was unable to go higher than the recommendation in his review for a cap of £50 million and was unable, in his terms of reference, to recommend a financial scheme that was unconstrained. Now, £75 million is a rise, but I agree with other members, this is not high enough. And Fighting with Pride has said that £150 million would be more realistic in terms of an estimate for its potential to provide real justice to the people who might come forwards. But in the interest of real justice, I don't believe we can cap this number at all. As the Royal British Legion has said in response to the earlier proposed cap, a cap provides an incentive for the Ministry of Defence to limit the number of people who get through and apply for compensation. This is in opposition to the aim of achieving fair recompense. And I would add a comment on this that Fighting with Pride have made today, that will the flat rate of £50,000 really be able to compensate for the pensions that would have been earned by all those people who were discharged early. And then, as Craig pointed out to me, this has been a discrete community. And I think we still don't know how many people could come forward having been harmed by these unjust policies in ways not envisaged by the strict types of payment described in today's statement, which sets out, it says for the wider impact payment, we are talking about harassment, invasive investigations and imprisonment. And I would really welcome some clarity from the Minister today that this might go further. I can envisage people who have resigned due to feeling that they can't come out, due to feeling that they can't live as they would. They have still suffered harm. They've been unable to fulfil their full potential. That is genuine harm. I can envisage people, I mean, we talk about shame and honour in the stories that we've heard. People wanting potentially their colleagues to preserve their honour, to not feel ashamed, being discharged for stated other reasons. So nothing in the written record would confirm that they had suffered from the harms that the flat rate payment is envisaged to pay for. But nevertheless, they've suffered exactly the same harm. I would welcome some clarification, not only that you might go wider, but that you might be willing to be challenged. Sorry, that the Minister would be willing to be challenged on these terms in the future. I do think this conversation must bring the full comfort and security in older age that is enshrined in the Armed Forces Covenant. It must bring true justice for the community that was shamed so shamefully, and I do think these payments need looking at again. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Oliver Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Secretary of State and indeed his honourable and gallant Minister of State for their intense understanding of this issue and of the whole veterans community. This debate is at a critical juncture in the story of these people of service who have been let down by our nation, a great source of national shame, as other members have said. Although progress has been made, we must ensure that these veterans, some of whom have suffered immensely at the hands of the state, are compensated adequately. And I'm pleased to hear the Secretary of State's announcement today, especially around the financial arrangements, deliver it as promised, a victory and a long time coming for these people. As a gay man in this place, I'm all too aware that we stand on the shoulders of campaigners, activists and giants of the LGBT rights movement who have come before us. For over 3 decades, individuals who did or wanted to serve this country were shamed or risked being shamed, expelled, imprisoned, put on a register of sex offenders in some cases, and whose lives were destroyed for the sake of their sexuality. Madam Deputy Speaker, being LGBT is not a weakness, it's a strength. And we train and fight and serve as hard as anyone else, and like carbon, kept under the Earth's crust for a long time, diamonds emerge in our hearts because of those experiences. And these are the people that have built our forces over the years. We owe them a great debt. And I'm glad that this once accepted, indeed institutionalised, discrimination is over, and our forces are better for it. Our country is stronger for it. But for so long, the values we hold dear of respect, of duty, service and honour were not upheld for these people who were let down, like my constituent Stephen, without whom, and I've told the story before, I wouldn't be stood here raising this issue. This is a man that lobbied me from day one of my selection as the Labour candidate and continues to lobby me for this to this day, and is completely right in doing so. Expelled on suspicion of his sexuality. A life taken from pride in what he was doing to ruin, actually. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my recent adjournment debate, we heard stories, truly heartbreaking and harrowing stories of service and indeed betrayal of that service by those in power at the time. And as I said in that debate, and I repeat again today, I want to pay tribute to Fighting with Pride, who've been at the forefront of this campaign, with other colleagues in the chamber today who've done the same. Individuals like Craig Jones, my friend Carl Austin-Bean, and even the noble lords that are in the gallery today, Lord Etherton and Lord Cashman, who've been a part of this over a long period of time, have done so much to raise awareness of the unique challenges faced by LGBT veterans and veterans more broadly. As the Minister knows, financial redress must be key to justice for these veterans, but the capped £50 million allocated was just plain inadequate for the level of trauma and destruction that these people experience, be it mental health crises, substance abuse, homelessness, destitution, disownment by families, being labelled as sex offenders, be victims of suicide, and more. And the scary thing is, this isn't ancient history. I've had stories come forward to me of people in the 90s, the late 90s, when I was a kid. It's not that long ago. I'm glad to hear today's announcement, because, frankly, true justice has always required a more substantial commitment financially. and one that acknowledges the suffering and delivers fair and meaningful compensation. And I must say that while I welcome the government's actions today, specifically around the scheme itself and the two-pronged approach, I do have some questions around the cap, especially for the second element of the scheme. I understand the first tranche and the flat rate approach, but the second tranche for those people that have experienced complete horrors, of which we'll probably hear more of in this debate, I wonder whether a cap in that area of 70,000, although that is a substantial amount of money, is in fact enough to redress the experiences that those people have been through. And I wonder whether the committee that the Secretary of State mentioned earlier that will assess on a case-by-case basis some of the experience of these veterans may be better experienced to make an assumption as to where the level of redress should be, perhaps with an overall COP, although I understand, particularly from the view of the Treasury bench, this cannot always be possible. But I think the maximum amount of flexibility is perhaps best to deal with some of these specific cases, some of which are completely harrowing. Lord Etherton's review offered a crucial roadmap, and the noble Lord has done veterans, and indeed our country, a great service in bringing us to this point. Completing the recommendations in full will ensure that veterans, regardless of their orientation, are treated with respect and fairness, and it will honour, from a government's perspective, the contract that was started with these men and women so long ago, and a contract that was broken on the side of the government to these people. Lastly, can I welcome the restoration of rank and dismissal reasoning, and thank the Minister for listening all the way through this process. I know that the member for Brighton and Kemptown and Peacehaven has long been a champion of this, literally I think since the first day we were here, has mentioned this to me, and I know it's been a long listening exercise for the Minister. There is, I think, still a little further to go to make sure there's maximum flexibility for our veterans, but I know he's doing his best to really make sure that this is championed and to right this wrong. But I think today can be considered a great victory for these fighters. I think there's a little bit further to go, perhaps, but can I thank the Minister and Secretary of State for taking the time, and thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for allowing me to contribute.
Cameron Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a retired RAF police officer, I was particularly moved by the stories during which my own branch seems to have acted so zealously, and perhaps it's appropriate that I apologise on behalf of the RAF Police. My colleague, the Honourable Member for Epsom and Ewell, made the same request on behalf of the Royal Military Police. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm glad that at length this debate is now being held in this House after it was deprioritised by the previous government. Perhaps it would have been a required Olympic standard political gymnastics to show empathy with the victims of the LGBT ban, apologising to those victims, as did Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, whilst manufacturing...
I made the point earlier, we do not in this House refer to serving members of the House by name. He remains the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and North Allerton.
Thank you for correcting me, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Right Honourable Member for Richmond and North Allerton, and doing so whilst the mother of Brianna Jai was in this, on this estate. I appreciate that's a bit of a change of tone from the rest of this debate, but I do think it's important that we recognise that the rhetoric we use in this House has a cultural impact across the rest of society. The government should be proud that it's brought this debate before the House. They have my gratitude, and I know that there are people present who were directly affected by this ban. That includes Leslie Davison, who's travelled from South Devon today to stand in the gallery with us. Our LGBT veterans should have been able to serve fully their honourable careers and retire simply as veterans. But they were unfairly discarded by the Ministry of Defence in line with the laws of the very country that they served. The Ministry of Defence is right to describe this as a moral stain upon the armed forces, but also on the history of our country. One haunting testimony comes from a constituent of North Shropshire, an account as to how hundreds of gallant, proud, selfless service personnel were hunted by the military police, arrested, interrogated, and often imprisoned for even an assumption of their sexuality. Take a moment, if you wouldn't mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, to imagine the line of questioning of an interrogation into one's sexuality. To everybody who was in any way affected by this ban, I believe you and I am sorry. By the time I joined the Royal Air Force in 2000, the ban had been lifted, but the legacy of that ban and of the political culture of the time was a toxic mentality which remained for several years in plain sight. I recall my initial trade training at RAF Cosford. One particularly notorious training team threatened to call ahead to my future unit and have my head caved in once I arrived, merely for daring to voice support for the LGBT community. I was 17. I'm sure that such intolerance continues to persist in small pockets of narrow-mindedness beneath the surface today, but I am proud that the RAF I left in 2023 is indeed a greatly transformed and more inclusive organisation. I am now simply a veteran. During the general election campaign in June of this year, I joined some local veterans for a communal breakfast in Tewkesbury. Decent, honest and selfless, they meet regularly and welcomed me as one of their own. But before I was introduced to the group at large, one person pulled me aside and whispered, "Don't worry about the he-she, we just ignore it." Turned out that it was transgender Royal Navy veteran Gina Shelton, who had served in the closet as a man despite internally identifying as a woman. This to avoid persecution from her own friends and colleagues. I spent a few minutes speaking with her. She was seated clearly separately from the rest of the main group, and I could not help but to feel moved by her courage and dignity as she spoke matter-of-factly as to her circumstances, but with an affection and an understanding for those fellow veterans who even now disowned her. She took responsibility for the way she was now ostracised, which I admire but reject. I otherwise enjoyed the company of my fellow veterans. I should reiterate, these are decent, honest people, but meeting Gina reminded me that changing minds is the greatest challenge before us, and that challenge will endure long after legislation. The Liberal Democrats have always stood with the LGBT plus community, and we are proud to have brought the Equal Marriage Bill into law whilst in government. I'm proud that those unjustly treated by the LGBT ban have now been able to speak their truth, and it is difficult to put a monetary figure on such an injustice. But having considered the announcement by the Secretary of State this afternoon, we still call to stand with the Royal British Legion and Fighting with Pride for an uplift of this fund to £150 million. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, let these veterans' legacy not be one of tragedy, but that the members of this House learn the lesson that the previous government never did, that the language we use here has real-world consequences. Thank you.
Alex Baker.
This is an important day for a whole generation of ex-service personnel in my constituency and across the UK who lost everything they knew because of a policy that was discriminatory and wrong. I want to pay tribute to the charity Fighting with Pride and the coalition who have led this campaign with the dignity of ex-service personnel in the very best of that tradition. We speak a lot in this House about the tremendous debt and respect we owe to our armed forces. It's something we feel very deeply in Aldershot and Farnborough, as people from our community have served in every major conflict that our country has faced over the past 200 years. Yet the stories we are hearing today remind us how that respect isn't just about words, it's about deeds. I want to thank Lord Etherton for his work and for the government for listening, responding and taking action. I want to use my time in this debate today to actually draw the House's thought to the sister ban of this policy that the government is rightly compensating people for. The ban on people living with HIV joining or serving in our military. This was not repealed in 2000. It was repealed in 2022. And even now, there are loopholes that are still being exploited. So regressive were the rules that people were banned from joining the armed forces, even if they were HIV negative, but taking the HIV prevention drug PrEP. Regrettably, but not surprisingly, opportunities to revise these rules were missed in 2008, 2016, and yet again in 2019. Even as the British government accepted the can't pass it on science about people living with HIV on treatment in the years that followed, no change was forthcoming. If they were already in service, the serving personnel were labelled medically not deployable. Instead, it took Terence Higgins Trust, National AIDS Trust, and a remarkable Hampshire resident, Lieutenant Commander Oliver Brown MBE, to right this wrong. Ollie was cycling through London when a brick hit his bike and he hit a wall. He was taken to a London hospital, and as is finally becoming custom, due to the last government and also the 27 million announced by the Prime Minister last week, he was routinely tested for HIV. He discovered he was positive. As his broken arm was being fixed, he had to come to terms with a stigmatised diagnosis and worry not about would I live or have my family's support, but did I have a job or a place to live? When he told his employer, the Royal Navy, he was labelled and held back. Thankfully, he found similar guts and spirit to Craig and Fighting with Pride, and he became a relentless campaigner on this issue. In June 2022, the rules were finally swept away, not just for the LGBT community, but anyone living with HIV. Days later, the Civilian Aviation Authority did the same and removed all barriers to pilots living with HIV on medication, which is why everyone involved was so surprised that the military aviation authorities gave themselves an extra 2 months to remove the ban, and the obligations that were made then have still not been fully fulfilled. People living with HIV are still not able to join the armed forces as aircrew or controllers. It would be a great thing off the back of this debate if my honourable friend could commit to investigate this issue and agree to meet with Oliver Brown, Terence Higgins Trust and the National AIDS Trust to find a path forward on this issue. We need to turn our military culture from the absence of bans to one that promotes HIV and sexual health testing, where taking charge of your sexual health is encouraged, and a place where HIV stigma has no home. Our amazing HIV charities are on hand to help, and the UK could be the first fast-track military committing itself to the goal of zero HIV transmissions, zero preventable deaths, and zero HIV stigma. To meet this global goal, we need our armed forces to do their bit. If we do it, it will be the first time we have stopped the onward transmission of any virus without a vaccine or a cure. We cannot fail. Today is a great day, but for the fight for equality is a journey, not a destination.
James Asser.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I draw the House to my register of interests. I am very pleased to be able to speak in this debate as one of the newly elected co-chairs of the LGBT PLP, and it's a great honour to follow a number of honourable members and this very powerful testimonies we have heard from veterans. It's very difficult to follow that and to do justice, but other than the words that they have spoken. There is much interest in this debate and into the review into LGBT veterans, and my honourable friend, the member for Burnley, as he mentioned earlier, recently held an adjournment debate on this topic, and he raised the issues that the ban had on those that were dismissed under the measures, many of which we have heard from veterans themselves today. And those dismissed under those measures: broken family relationships, poor mental health issues, marginalisation driven by the shame of being thrown out of the military. And he rightly highlighted in that debate that it did not only impact on LGBT people, but those merely suspected of not being heterosexual. And also on all those serving, for the climate of fear and discrimination that it drove within the military. My honourable friend said in that debate that as a young gay man it seems an alien world. But of course this is not discrimination from a century ago, but from our lifetime or within living memory. Looking at the history of this campaign, which was a focus of much energy in the 1990s, when I was in the early days of my political campaigning, it is worth noting there was an attempt 28 years ago to change the law so that lesbians and gay men could serve in the military. In that debate, the then MP for Liverpool Garston, Eddie Lloyden, intervened on the minister who was defending the status quo. Eddie was, as he explained, one of the few remaining members in the House at that time who had served in the whole of the Second World War. The question he put to the minister, which I remember seeing at the time, is worth repeating in this debate. Speaking of World War II, he said, "I was in no fewer than 7 troop ships carrying men and women to the 4 corners of the globe to fight on behalf of our nation. There were no questions about homosexuality then, and if there was a war tomorrow, there would be no discrimination against homosexuals or lesbians. They would be dragged in as they were in 1939. Now, of course, there was plenty of discrimination pre-1967 and at that time, but the point he was making was that this was not just a policy based on discrimination, but one based on hypocrisy too. Hypocrisy as distinguished service was duly undertaken, often honoured and recognised with medals, only for that to be disregarded and thrown aside when the question of someone's sexuality was then raised. Far too many people suffered from that policy, and the opportunity to end it earlier was lost as the government of the day asserted that it would undermine military effectiveness if LGBT people were allowed to serve. My West Ham predecessor in that debate, Tony Banks, was heard to shout rubbish at that assertion. He was, of course, right. Someone is a good soldier based on their skills. Bravery and good service are not dependent on someone's sexuality. History has since proved it was rubbish, as over the last 25 years, since the change in the law, the military has continued to operate with distinction, and LGBT people have played their part with honour within it. That attempt to alter the law failed, and it took until 2000 for that change to take place, which led to continued discrimination and suffering for serving personnel, as we have heard today. Those targeted did not only lose their jobs, but their reputations, their rank, and until the 1990s, it's worth bearing in mind that's a quarter of a century after the decriminalisation of homosexuality in civilian life, criminal convictions and jail time. It's perhaps worth noting how much has changed in the time since that debate of 1996. Then we only had one openly gay MP, Chris Smith. The idea that Parliament would have so many LGBT MPs now would have been possible to believe. And most of the freedoms and the privileges that the LGBT community now enjoys were yet to come, and for many of them were beyond the possibility of even campaigning for. This House has changed, the law has changed, and society has changed too, and has changed for the better. But the impact of the policy and the ban has a long tail, and veterans are still dealing with that impact today. This is why Lord Etherton's report is so important. This is a live issue we must resolve, and I welcome the progress we have made as a society and the progress on delivering on the recommendations. I very much welcome today the announcement by my right honourable friend on the financial redress being made available to veterans. When I recently spoke to a veteran, they raised the issue of financial redress, as the impact of dismissal from the military has had a big impact on many, and some of whom are now of an age where the issue of support is pressing. So it will come as welcome news today that we are making further progress on this, and that the applications will open immediately. We must make sure all those who are eligible can easily apply. It is also very welcome that veterans will see the restoration of their rank and their service record amended. And I very much welcome that pre-1967 veterans are also being considered. It is important that we ensure we deliver on all the recommendations in the report, to ensure that all of those who have served and have faced discrimination can now wear their medals and remember their service with honour and pride. And we can wipe away the hypocrisy that took their service to their country and tried to tarnish it. It's important that we support them in that, but also work to create a culture of dignity and respect for those veterans, to value them as a society and to respect their service to their country and expunge the legacy of discrimination. We should, as so many have already done, pay tribute to the campaigners who have fought hard for this, many of whom I know are in the gallery, including those who stood and led the legal campaigns in the 1990s, and in more recent times the campaigners from Fighting with Pride. We are here because of them. This debate is built on their hard work. We have an opportunity to finally draw the legacy of that shameful policy to a close and place it fully into the dustbin of history. This is an opportunity we have to take. And I'm grateful the government is rising to that challenge. We must make sure we rise fully to the needs of that community.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today is a moment to acknowledge the historic injustice endured by LGBT veterans and reaffirm our collective responsibility as a House to right the wrongs of the past. Madam Deputy Speaker, if you'll allow me, I'll also share a story of one of my constituents, Professor Andrew Hartle, a man whose life epitomises the resilience and achievements of LGBT veterans against the odds. Andrew joined the Royal Air Force in the 1980s, full of ambition and a desire to serve his country. His early years in uniform were marked by excellence. He rose swiftly through the ranks as a medical officer, participating in search and rescue missions and serving in the First Gulf War. But while Andrew was fulfilling his duties, he was living a double life, weighed down by a constant fear of being discovered. At a time when being openly gay in the armed forces was not just taboo, but illegal, Andrew faced an impossible conflict: to live authentically or to preserve the career he loved. In 1996, Andrew was outed in a tabloid newspaper with the horrifying headline, "RAF Docs Gay Fling with an AIDS Victim." Andrew was suspended, subjected to demeaning accusations, and eventually forced to resign. For 7 agonising months, Andrew was left in limbo, isolated from colleagues, forbidden from his NHS place of work, and ostracised by an institution he had dedicated his life to serving. Andrew continued to face prejudice throughout his career. NHS administrators demanded he take an HIV test against his will, just one of many humiliating incidents that he experienced after leaving the military. And despite that discrimination and the obstacles he faced, Andrew became the first openly gay consultant anaesthetist working at St Mary's Hospital, a world-class hospital serving many of my constituents in Kensington and Bayswater. He rebuilt his life and career, became a trailblazer in his field, and has been a powerful advocate for justice. But for Andrew and for so many others, the scars inflicted by the gay ban remain. And as Andrew reflected in his own words, "Coming out as I did was not my plan. My mental health deteriorated, and I buried the impact of my outing and dismissal." But Andrew was one of the fortunate ones and is here in the gallery with us today and spoke so powerfully on the radio this morning. Many others were not as lucky. So I welcome the government's announcement today to move from apology to action. The apology given last year by the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and Northallerton, was long overdue and was right. He was right to describe the ban on LGBT people serving in the military as an appalling failure of the British state, highlighting the abuse, harassment and discrimination that many suffered. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, words alone are not enough, and this government has been clear that it will tackle historic injustices head-on, from Horizon to Grenfell, infected blood, and now the horrific legacy of the ban and mistreatment of LGBT veterans. So with today's announcement, we take a meaningful step forward to support those veterans who suffered at the hands of the British state. I welcome the scheme's focus on simplicity and speed of payment. That is vital for veterans who have waited decades for justice. And I also welcome the Secretary of State's clarification that these reparations will be ring-fenced, ensuring veterans will not lose access to tax or benefits as a result. And this moment would not have been possible without the tireless advocacy of organisations like Fighting with Pride. So I thank them and others for your dedication in supporting LGBT veterans and for your crucial role in securing today's announcement. And of course to Lord Etherton for his review. Madam Deputy Speaker, Andrew's story reminds us of the immense personal cost of injustice. His courage, perseverance and achievement should inspire all of us. Andrew has waited 27 years, but some have waited as long as 50. And tragically, many veterans have died without ever seeing justice. So as we approach January 12th, the 25th anniversary of the lifting of the ban, we must also focus now on the task ahead of us, to locate and support all eligible veterans to come forward and ensure no one is left behind. And I hope the Veterans Minister can provide further detail on that strategy in his closing. We must honour those who served in silence, who lived in fear and who were ostracised simply for being themselves and loving who they loved. This is not merely an act of kindness, it's a moral obligation, and I am proud that this government is resolute in its determination to deliver it.
Rachel Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And could I draw the House's attention to my register of interest? I'm humbled by the testimonies that have been shared by my honourable friends on both sides of the House, but particularly moved by my friend, the member for Shrewsbury. The testimonies that have been shared show us how ashamed we should be that our country treated so many people so badly for so long. Make no mistake, we've had LGBT people in our armed services for as long as we've had armed services, and I am proud to call many of them my close friends. They have shared with me their harrowing stories, but what always shines through is their loyalty to their service and their country. Today makes me proud to be a Labour MP. I remember the Labour government lifting the ban on LGBT soldiers in 2000, and I celebrated that with my friends. It was Labour who argued for the Etherton review, and I would like to thank Lord Etherton for his work. And now, as a Labour MP, I welcome those recommendations, and I will fight for every LGBT veteran to get the compensation that they deserve. The historic treatment of our veterans was a moral stain on our nation. It was wrong on every single level. We will never know how many good men and women were too afraid even to ever apply to serve their country, or too afraid to ever come out to this day. So many LGBT soldiers had their hopes and aspirations cut short despite their commitment to serve our country. They were left feeling ashamed, demoralised and humiliated when they should have been proud, like I am proud to be a member of the LGBT community. We can't undo the damage of the past, but we can make sure that those who are affected receive what they are owed. I want to pay tribute to all the veterans who are with us today and to Fighting with Pride, who've been supporting LGBT veterans for years and who have pushed governments to do better. I also want to pay tribute to Kelly Holmes, whose personal account was so difficult to hear recently, but was so typical of so many women I have spoken to. I want to encourage every LGBT veteran to apply to have their rank restored so that they can feel pride again in the service that they did for our country. It's time to renew the nation's contract with all those who have served. and delivering Lord Etherton's recommendations is just a small part of that. I hope that today is another historic landmark in the fight for equality for LGBT people in this country, and I will be supporting any veterans to get the compensation that they deserve, to restore their dignity and the pride that they have for their service for our country.
Yeah. Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I start by welcoming Lord Etherton's review and thanking all those organisations and campaign groups that contributed to it, including Fighting with Pride, as has been said earlier. As my honourable friend for Shrewsbury rightly said, this is welcomed, but it's so late. I'd like to also place on record my thanks to my constituents in Suffolk Coastal, who raised the issue with me directly and worked for years to support their former military colleagues who have suffered at the hands of this abhorrent and humiliating practice. In particular, Calvin Friend, who contributed to the review and has engaged with me directly on the issue. He and his colleagues, Terry Skipmore and Simon Wallington, were perceived as gay in the late 90s and late 80s and treated appallingly as a result. It is important today that we acknowledge that there are many former armed service personnel who did not live to see this justice come about. Either they died of natural death since the ban was removed, or they devastatingly took their own lives. Many of those still living have attempted to die by suicide or have thought to do so, and I've heard from campaign groups and charities some of the appalling stories as well. The Etherton Review has exposed some harrowing stories of our members from the armed forces and how they are treated by the very institution that they were prepared to give their life to. Can I also thank the Royal British Legion, who among other charities and campaign groups provided evidence to this review and who themselves have highlighted some of these appalling stories from former veterans, men and women, who faced at best humiliation and at its worst degrading and appalling acts of intimidation, as well as needless discharge from the armed forces, and in some cases imprisonment and no access to their military pensions, as we've heard today. I want to reiterate that the cultural and operational justifications for this previous ban, as described and endorsed by the Ministry of Defence at the time, have rightly been criticised in Lord Etherton's report as an incomprehensible policy of homophobic bigotry. It is crucial that we learn from these past mistakes and the principles of equality and respect that underpin our society are taken forward. In 2002, I attended military college, Welbeck College, and after I left, I joined the Territorial Army, serving in the Royal Logistics Corps. This was just a few short years after the ban was lifted, but the shadow of the policy was still very much evident. Serving personnel were terrified of being found out, still living their lives in the shadow. At college, I had teachers and PT instructors who had lived with and lived through the ban, personally been affected by the homophobic policy themselves, or seen firsthand how friends and serving colleagues had been bullied out of the army and lived their life in the shadows. Unsurprisingly, many have suffered from mental health problems brought on by living and working in an institution that had previously tried to hunt them out for being gay or bisexual. And though the ban was lifted by the time I left Welbeck College and the TA, I saw how the culture was still lingering for LGBT colleagues. We've heard today in the debate earlier that though it was banned in 2000, the culture and the practice was still very much evident amongst serving personnel. Colleagues who felt still when I was there that they had to hide their sexual orientation, and it was still something they needed to be ashamed of. Not something to be proud of or open about in the way that we do today and the way that we take it for granted in this society now. The impact of this abhorrent practice cannot be overstated. The lifelong scar it has had on so many who gave so much to our nation is a stain on our military history and more widely on our society. The recommendations from this review rightly recommend that compensation be an appropriate means of redress. I am delighted that we have increased the compensation from 50 million to 75 million. If that had been left unchanged, it could have equalled just as little as £12,500 per claimant. I would urge the government to make sure that the payments, when they are made quickly and without delay. It is important that we do what we can to make sure this compensation is released quickly and to those that deserve it. So I welcome this announcement today, and I would like to end by once again thanking all those who contributed to the review and who took the review forward. The work that has been done to make sure the recommendations in the review as we carry on will go some way to make sure that the past failures of the Ministry of Defence are once recognised. Thank you.
Anna Gelderd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a privilege to participate in this important debate today and to hear many moving accounts from contributions across both sides of the House. My constituency of South East Cornwall is an area that plays a crucial role in our nation's defence. The area ranks 7th in the UK for the veterans population, and Tor Point, a wonderful town, also home to HMS Raleigh, has the 3rd highest number of veterans of any community in the UK, with over 14% having served our country. I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for today's statement and to Lord Etherton for his crucial work on this topic. I'm also grateful to the Minister for Veterans and People for recently visiting Tor Point to meet with veterans from across the constituency. The visit was an important demonstration of Labour's commitment to our armed forces and to our veteran community. Today, we reflect on a deeply regrettable chapter in our history. As we've heard, prior to 2000, being a member of the LGBT+ community was considered incompatible with service in the armed forces. As a result, LGBT individuals, or those perceived to be, could be dismissed or forced to leave the military, robbing them of careers, livelihoods, and dignity. So I welcome the government's announcement today of support for our veterans. It is a historic step towards righting these wrongs. By increasing and in fact exceeding the recommendation of the review for funding for the LGBT financial recognition scheme, the government continues to provide an unwavering commitment to supporting our veterans. I'd also like to acknowledge the brilliant work that Fighting with Pride are doing to support the well-being of LGBT+ veterans, armed forces personnel and their families. Their efforts, alongside the Royal British Legion, Help for Heroes, Stonewall, SAFA and many others, are invaluable. I've heard from constituents who have been personally affected by this injustice, and I'm so grateful for their work and for sharing their stories with me. I'm immensely proud of our serving LGBT+ personnel and veterans from South East Cornwall and across the nation. Their resilience, despite the adversity they faced, is a testament to their strength and dedication to keeping us safe. I look forward to hearing from the Minister, and I hope to hear more in due course about the progress being made on this vital topic. Thank you.
Gil Crichton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Chair for its forbearance. I very much welcome the announcement made by the Secretary of State today, although its arrival is almost as late as my own arrival in the Chamber today, and for that I apologise. The ban on LGBT people serving the armed forces until the year 2000 was a fair mistake, and the delay in announcing reparations is a failure too, which is in danger of eroding public faith in politics to deliver for people. I see no point in blaming the previous government. In fact, I commend the work of the previous government and Lord Etherton and our own government in bringing forward the scheme so swiftly now. But just as we saw with the scandal of Hillsborough, the infected blood scandal, post office horizon scandal, we must move quicker to compensate people. I concur with my friend Dumfries and Galloway and my friend for Aberdeen North, who emphasised that this scheme must be delivered swiftly and in a measured way. Because a long delay simply prolongs the agony of many veterans who have waited decades for an apology and have waited today for formal financial reparations to be announced. I have a constituent, Janice McKeever, who served in the British Army and was caught up in this dark period of our history in the 1990s, 30 years ago. Miss McKeever served with the Army Intelligence Corps in Hong Kong and in England from 1992 to 1994. There was nothing wrong with her work or her service for the country, but on the 30th of June 1994, she was unceremoniously and dreadfully kicked out of the British Army and sent back from Hong Kong simply because of who she was. Now, many veterans affected by this scandal have lost their homes, their health, their peace of mind because of the awful treatment meted out to them. Miss McKeever is a resilient individual. Islanders tend to be. She managed to get herself back on her feet, served her country in another way as a police officer, a 2-decade-long career of public service, but some people, as we've heard today, never made it that far. What happened to Janice happened 30 years ago, but Miss McKeever was one of the first over my threshold at my Stornoway constituency office when I was elected. What happened to her still stings, still hurts. She did get a letter of apology from the head of the army, which she appreciates, a new burial, and the Intelligence Corps are to welcome her back to base in a ceremony next month. And it's fantastic that Janice's sister is flying from Australia to be with her, to support her at that event. The new levels of compensation are very welcome, but for Janice and many other veterans, it is not just about the money. It is about having a proper acknowledgement and acceptance that what was done to her, the way she was treated by her country after serving her country, was wrong. This announcement, I hope, will go some way to repairing the damage done. I hope that the event with this, that sad episode, will be done and dusted, but it ought to be recorded and acknowledged in Army records and Army museums. But it belongs in the past. What happened to Janice and thousands of other veterans was wrong, and that is so evident. And it is widely acknowledged too, and it is a shame that it has taken so many years to put that right. But I'm glad of today's statement and hope that LGBT service personnel and veterans can now say, finally, that they have served with pride. Thank you.
Shadow Minister James Cartlidge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with the leave of the House, I'm winding up as well as opening. As you can see, there are only two of us, and there's a bill committee at the same time. And there are some things we can't physically get around in that situation. But very grateful to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for letting me wind up. And it enables me to pay tribute to some absolutely incredible speeches today, all of them moving and sharing many, many traumatic case studies of their constituents, which underline exactly why the government has announced what it has today, and based on the review that we launched in government. There were some specific themes raised. The Honourable Gentleman from Brighton, Kemptown and Peacehaven spoke of time running out. My honourable friend for Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock also spoke about the issue of time, the urgency of getting this resolved. And my neighbour, the Honourable Lady for Suffolk Coastal, spoke how she wanted to see payments getting out quickly and without delay. And I'm sure we all agree with that, we all echo that sentiment, and I'm sure the Minister will give some clarity where he can, particularly on the second payment, the LGBT impact payment, which presumably will have a longer process given the presence of the panel, and if he could give some indication of the timings he expects in that regard. The Honourable Lady for South East Cornwall reminded me that we should thank our serving LGBT personnel, not just talk about the veterans. Of course, they serve in a very different military and a very different military culture today, and we wish them well and thank them for their public service today. There were many moving cases mentioned. What particularly struck me, Madam Deputy Speaker, was the reminder of the impact, literally the impact on those people concerned. The Honourable Lady from Mid Sussex spoke about a constituent, the case who was imprisoned. The Honourable Gentleman for East Worthing and Shoreham, in their case, they were put in a psychiatric ward because of being LGBT and coming forward. And my honourable friend for Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock spoke about, my apologies, for Dumfries and Galloway, spoke about his constituent attempting suicide and being sexually assaulted. In fact, yes, it was the Honourable Lady for Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock, who I should have referred to earlier, but she made an excellent quote, I thought. She said, these cases were the people who had denied, my apologies, we denied people their freedom while they were defending ours. I think I paraphrased, but I thought it was an excellent quote. Madam Speaker, there were other cases, though, which had, if you might say, some kind of happy ending, or at least went on to do other things of which we should honour. The Honourable Lady for Shrewsbury, in particular, spoke of a very moving case, who I understand is in the gallery today. I think Gunnar Ashton, who had obviously had a very difficult experience, but then went on, as she said, to carry, I believe, the banner of the Royal British Legion at Royal Albert Hall Remembrance Evening. I was at the most recent one. It's an incredible occasion, and so I pay tribute to her. The Honourable Gentleman for Kensington and Bayswater spoke about a constituent who became a very senior clinician. And also we heard from the Honourable Gentleman for the Western Isles, if he doesn't mind me calling it that, who spoke about his constituent who obviously suffered a great trauma but became a police officer, and it shows that he called it the resilience of islanders, and I think we've seen that in other cases spoken of today. The Honourable Lady for North Warwicks and Bedworth said that she believed there have been LGBT soldiers ever since we've had an army. Again, I paraphrase, but I think she's probably absolutely right. Of course, Lord Etherton hasn't gone back quite that far in his review, but echoing that theme, the Honourable Gentleman for West Ham and Beckton, in a very enjoyable speech, made the point that, of course, so many would have served in World War II. And we should remember that and pay tribute to them because, of course, that sacrifice is what gave us our freedom. That means we're here today. And he also made a very good point that I made in my opening speech, I think, which is that when we talk about military skill, about bravery, those features of people who serve in armed forces with distinction, they are irrelevant to background and to sexuality, and it's a very good point indeed. John Gentleman for Tewkesbury, of course, I believe a former RAF policeman made the point that the RAF has changed significantly, and that's important that he mentioned that point. And the Honourable Lady for Aldershot, along with the Honourable Gentleman for Kensington and Bayswater, reminded us of the importance of the HIV issue and the stigmatisation, the additional stigma that has been associated in that regard. And I think she made a very laudable point of calling for the aim of zero HIV stigma in the armed forces today, whether the Minister would want to comment on that. I think finally the Honourable Gentleman for Burnley, he had an adjournment debate recently on this subject, so he exemplifies the great persistence that we've seen from a number of colleagues in this House on this subject. A few aren't here at the moment. I think that may be because of a slightly premature end, but hopefully they will see in Hansard that I've paid tribute to their speeches, lots of excellent contributions, and I would just conclude by saying this, that as was said by the Secretary of State in his opening speech, in addition to implementing the recommendations of Lord Etherton's review, we must also make sure we thoroughly learn the lessons of this deeply sorry and regrettable episode in our defence history. They are two separate things, and it is crucial we do both. Terrible things were wholly unjustifiably inflicted upon brave and committed service personnel, with lifelong repercussions for those affected, as we have heard from cases up and down the country. It is incumbent upon all of us to reflect on this having happened in our country. All those who put themselves forward for service must be treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve. And to conclude, we should all share in the mission to correct this historic wrong, because we all know that every person affected will have equally shared the same values of freedom, patriotism and public service as anyone else in the armed forces. So today we salute them, and as far as we are able, take further significant steps to restore full and formal recognition of the role of LGBT veterans serving our country.
Minister Alison.
Thank you, Deputy Madam Speaker. What a debate we've had today, and we've heard some exceptionally harrowing and indeed inconceivable stories that have taken place in our lifetime. And on that note, and on behalf of the Minister of Defence, I would like to apologise to all of those affected by the ban. Indeed, the way the Minister of Defence mistreated LGBT personnel between 1967 and 2000 has been a flaming injustice that has burnt for more than 5 decades. It is an injustice acknowledged by Lord Etherton's excellent report last year, and as I said during our debate 6 weeks ago, it's an injustice that put the Ministry of Defence on the wrong side of history. It's an injustice that the last government worked to heal, with the support of members on all sides of the House, and for that we thank you. And when the scheme opens tomorrow at 0900 hours, when we will finally begin the important process of offering financial recognition for the pain caused, we will turn a chapter in defence history. Deputy Madam Speaker, this government has taken the decision to increase the amount that can be dispersed by the scheme by 50% more than the plans we inherited. Not only will those dismissed or discharged from service receive a payment, but also those that were impacted more broadly by that ban. But it's important to acknowledge at the outset that no amount of money at all, can undo the hurt and pain caused, and no process can genuinely quantify that impact on earnings. This is a financial acknowledgement by the state of wrongdoing and regret, and whilst I know it will not fully satisfy all, I do hope it will help bring affirmation and some closure to those affected. The financial recognition scheme will also address 2 more of Lord Etherton's 49 recommendations, including rank restoration and rewriting those records, leaving just 7 to be complete, which remains a major priority. May I thank all the members of the House on both sides for bringing comments forward and those harrowing stories, and I'll now try and address some of those specific questions. To the honourable friend from Brighton, Kemptown and Peacehaven, we're working exceptionally hard with Fighting with Pride and 10 other charities to ensure that we advertise this scheme as broad as possible across the community. And indeed, this debate itself is one way to get that message out. We have 24 months of the recognition scheme. That's primarily because of the prerogative powers, but also following the recommendations of Lord Etherton's report. We've also allocated 90,000 to help charities help those veterans with those applications, because we acknowledge some of the processes may not be as simple as others. We're also asking for a reverse burden of proof on the access of the 25 million financial total. To predict the amount of cases that will come forward will be exceptionally difficult. Experiences will differ, time served will differ, and therefore the amount of recognition will differ as well. So it will be difficult to give you an assessment of the amount of people that come forward. In line with my honourable member from Dumfries and Galloway, facing the Treasury is much safer than perhaps facing the enemy. But nevertheless, I'd like to thank those within the Treasury and the broader team within the Ministry of Defence working really hard and being championed by the Secretary of State for Defence to deliver this 25 million extra, which again is that 50% increase on what we had previously. The speed to deliver is absolutely essential, and we've gone for speed and breadth. The speed to deliver this as fast as feasibly possible, but also the breadth to ensure all of those affected by the ban, both dismissed and discharged, but also those, as the honourable member mentioned earlier, about individuals who may have been impacted by the ban but not necessarily recorded, will also be able to apply for those resources. For the honourable member of South Suffolk, we appreciate your comments, and we also appreciate your work prior to us coming into government. The LGBT veterans, I hope, now feel part of the veterans family more than ever before. And I think that's primarily down to the broader restorative measures put within Lord Etherton's report that have gone so far to delivering it. And we are 42 out of 49 of those recommendations, and I think we'll close them out by 2027. Some of them don't sit in our government, but we're working very hard with the Office for Veterans Affairs and other government departments to close those out as fast as possible. For the honourable member from Aberdeen North, Brighton Pavilion, I'll cover two of your points now and go into some more later. Overseas applications absolutely can apply, so that's open to everyone. We will have a look at the geographical spread of that charitable sport. We don't have a huge amount of control over it, but we'll make sure that that's balanced, and we'll work with the Office of Veterans Affairs to deliver that. For the my honourable friend from Aldershot bringing up HIV, I think is a really important subject, and I can confirm that we're actually on the case now. Whilst there is no blanket ban on HIV-positive personnel flying within the armed forces, we're absolutely committed in this government to ensuring our policies that impact people living with HIV are regularly reviewed. And myself and the Minister for Armed Forces in particular are looking very closely at HIV policies relating to aircrew. And we'll get back to the honourable friend in due course. There were several members who mentioned a concern about the cap. Honourable friend from Burnley, the honourable members from Epsom, Ewell, Aberdeen North and Brighton Pavilion. The financial recognition scheme is a response to a gross injustice. We acknowledge that. It was designed to be a tangible acknowledgement of wrongdoing and regret, and was never intended to compensate for loss of earnings. So I accept that for good reason, there will always be those who feel we have not gone far enough. Whilst we'd all like to do more, yes, I will.
Minister for giving way. A North Cornwall constituent of mine earlier attended in the gallery but has had to leave due to the outrage that he feels. Does the Minister agree with me that greater financial compensation should be given to veterans, such as my constituent, who suffered such enormous harm, including gang rape and severe physical assault resulting in lifetime disabilities?
I'd like to thank the honourable member for that question. We've tried to balance demands for individual circumstances to be fully recognised on a case-by-case basis, with demands for a speedy resolution. We've arrived at amounts that reflect the practice of relevant employment tribunals and payments made for harm and suffering in the service complaints process, which also align with similar-sized payments awarded by the scheme in Canada. So whilst government schemes of this type will always cause debate, and I acknowledge that, we've done our best to be fair and balanced, using figures based on relevant precedents, and a process that will reflect individual circumstances within a framework designed to avoid delay and ensure fairness across that cohort. I think it's probably worthwhile just digging into that a little bit more detail to provide you some of those answers. The LGBT dismissed or discharge payment for veterans who were dismissed or discharged based solely on their sexual orientation or gender identity under the ban, there will be a flat rate of £50,000. The LGBT impact payment is open to all those who experience any pain and suffering directly related to the ban, including bullying and harassment, invasive investigation and, of course, imprisonment, and those who were dismissed and discharged can also apply for this. The LGBT impact payments will be assessed by an independent panel against 3 tariffs, 1 to 5,000, 5 to 10,000, 10 to 20,000, and up to a maximum of 20,000 to ensure awards are proportionate with that level of impact. We also had several questions about why it was perhaps taken so long, specifically from my honourable friend from Shrewsbury. Today is more than 50 years in the making, so I totally agree that veterans have waited far too long for this recognition of historical injustice. But since coming into government, we have moved exceptionally fast. This government has a bias for action. We came into government in July, we listened to Fighting with Pride, the LGBT veterans, we informed and updated the House and colleagues last month, we designed a broad and rapid payment scheme, and at 0900 hours tomorrow, that scheme will deliver and be open. We also had some questions on the compensation and the impact on loss of earnings, particularly to do with pensions. It's worth just noting that this is not a compensation scheme, and it has not been designed as such. With such a variety of experiences and personal circumstances within the affected community and limited evidence available, it would be difficult to estimate how long each veteran would have served if not for the ban, and what rank they might have reached. And in relation, finally, to the honourable member's question about Etherton's recommendations, 2 are for Defence to implement, 5 are for the National Service to address. My team are in touch with the Department for Health Services as we move that forward. It's worth noting, I think was covered by various members in the House today, the broader non-financial restorative measures that were taking place. There are 719 applications already, which is fantastic. And in practice, this means everything from apology letters sent directly to individuals from the Chiefs of the Army, the Royal Navy and Air Force, through to medals and berries, and ensuring again that those veterans feel absolutely an included part of the veterans community. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I joined the Royal Marines in 1999, this abhorrent ban on homosexuality in the armed forces was still in place. Today, a quarter of a century later, we turn a page on that shameful chapter in our national story. The financial recognition scheme is an acknowledgement by the state that it was wrong. And whilst I accept many veterans will continue to feel it does not go far enough, the scheme is another vindication of the harm and pain they have suffered. And vindication for all those who have stood against the ban. I urge everyone affected by these past feelings to access the final financial recognition scheme and other restorative measures by visiting the LGBT Veteran Support page on the government.uk website. On this page, you will find a simple guide explaining how to apply for the financial recognition payments, which includes details of the scheme, eligibility, and the supporting documents required. There are simple screenshots of what to expect when you apply, and the application form itself has been streamlined to make this process straightforward and user-friendly to ensure veterans can undertake this application with the most ease as possible. Prior to finalising or closing this debate, I would like to thank Lord Etherton for his outstanding work on this report. I would also like to thank the LGBT community and the charities that have supported us, in particular Fighting with Pride. For their courage and continued efforts to bring this to resolution, we have engaged comprehensively throughout this programme, both with the MOD team and myself, and I have an old saying from combat. It's that courage is a decision. It is not a reaction. Few have been so courageous as those watching this debate today, to stand up, to struggle to your feet when everyone's trying to push you down, to shout when everyone is trying to silence you. It's an active decision to do so, and perhaps the most courageous decision of them all. They should stand proud from here on out. This debate today, the speed in which we have worked, the fact that from tomorrow at 0900 this scheme will open is a credit to all those that have worked on the team. It also reaffirms this government is a government of action, and indeed we have a bias for action, and the Defence Secretary and I will continue to drive this forward until every recommendation of Lord Etherton's review is implemented, to right the wrongs of the past. To some of the names of the individuals affected, Victoria, Craig, Danny, Claire, Andrew, Janice, to name but a few, we apologise. We hope that this will go some way through the healing process, and we would like to assure, in line with Claire Ashton and an honourable friend from Shrewsbury, that every veteran who has helped keep Britain secure receive the respect and support they deserve. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered Lord Etherton's independent review into the treatment of LGBT veterans. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.